Some names are more common than others. Today, Mary is a very common woman's name, and it was even more common in first century Judaism. More than 1 out of every 5 women were named Mary at the time, and this has led to confusion about some of the Marys mentioned in the Bible, like Mary Magdalene and her relationship or lack of one to Martha and Lazarus. Let's take a look at that. Howdy, folks. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit that bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. You can also help us keep making this podcast and get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. In 2021, the Holy See announced that a memorial for the Bethany family, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, was being added to the general Roman calendar. For those who may not be aware, the general Roman calendar is the international liturgical calendar used in the Latin Catholic Church, and it is the basis for the particular calendars used in different countries. On the other hand, a memorial is a liturgical commemoration ranking below a solemnity and a feast, but above an optional memorial. Given the prominence of the Bethany family in the Gospels, they're mentioned as friends of Jesus in both Luke and John, it may come as a bit of a surprise that they didn't already have a place on the calendar. But there's a reason for that. The decree announcing the new memorial explains that the reason why the Bethany family didn't already have a spot on the calendar is because there had previously been some uncertainty about how 3 women in the Bible should be identified. The decree says, the traditional uncertainty of the Latin Church about the identity of Mary, the Magdalene to whom Christ appeared after his resurrection, the sister of Martha, and the sinner whose sins the Lord had forgiven, which resulted in the inclusion of Martha alone on July 29th in the Roman calendar, has been resolved in recent studies and times, as attested by the current Roman martyrology, which also commemorates Mary and Lazarus on that day. The 3 women were thus Mary Magdalene, who's mentioned, for example, in John 20, Mary, the sister of Martha, who's mentioned in Luke 10 and in John 11, and the woman whose sins Jesus forgave, who's mentioned in Luke 7. In the Latin Catholic Church, there has historically been a question of whether these 3 figures are actually one person, with some authors holding that they were. The reason this would cause a problem for giving the Bethany family a common slot on the calendar for, all 3 members of it, is that Mary Magdalene already had a slot. Mary Magdalene is mentioned in all 4 Gospels as one of the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection, and her liturgical day is July 22nd. What's more, it's a feast, which outranks a memorial, so it'd be odd to have a second day dedicated to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, since Mary would already be appearing on the calendar. She'd appear twice. As a result, in the past, Martha alone had a day on the liturgical calendar, which was July 29th. However, in the current edition of the Roman Martyrology, that's the Latin Church's official list of saints and martyrs, Mary and Lazarus are also now commemorated on that same day. That's what's in the Roman Martyrology, though, which is not the same thing as what's in the general Roman calendar. What the new decree did was help the calendar catch up with the Martyrology. Why has there been a question about the identities of these 3 women? Part of the reason is that the sinful woman that Luke mentions wiping Jesus' feet with her hair in chapter 7 of his gospel is unnamed. However, John says that Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, wiped Jesus' feet with her hair, and that could mean that they are the same person. On the other hand, it might not, because in the very next chapter, when John tells us the story of Mary wiping Jesus' feet with her hair, he doesn't say that she was a sinner. Luke also mentions the sinful woman weeping over Jesus' feet, but John doesn't mention Mary doing this. Also, since Luke does mention Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, that's in chapter 10 of his gospel, which comes after chapter 7, you'd think that he'd mention her by name if she was the sinful woman. Further, Luke presents the hair wiping incident occurring at a very different point in Jesus' ministry. In Luke, it's very early on in chapter 7, long before Jesus arrives in Jerusalem for Passion Week. While in John, Mary wipes Jesus' feet with her hair the day before the triumphal entry that begins Passion Week. That could be because the evangelists aren't required to keep events in strict chronological order, but it also could be that two different women performed similar actions to honor Jesus. As a result, this matter is still ambiguous. There is evidence that points both ways. The identity of the sinful woman has not been the key obstacle to giving the Bethany family a spot on the calendar, though. Instead, it's been the question of whether Mary Magdalene and Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, are the same person. There are, after all, multiple women named Mary in the New Testament. In fact, more than 1 in 5 Jewish women in first century Palestine were named Mary. You can see chapter 4 of Richard Baucham's outstanding book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, for more information on that. With a name as common as Mary, people in the first century Jewish community needed ways to tell them apart, but they couldn't do it the way we do, since people back then didn't have last names like we do. They needed to use something else. One of the most common ways of telling one person from another was by using a patronym, that is, to call them by a name that reflected the name of their father. Patronyms are still used in many countries today, such as Russia and Iceland. For example, let's suppose that there's a pair of Icelandic children named Jan and Anna, and that their father is named Stefan. Jan, as Stefan's son, would then be Jan Stefansson, and Anna, as Stefan's daughter, would be Anna Stefansdotter. This is why St. Peter's birth name is Simon Bar Jonah, or Simon the son of John. Bar is just the Aramaic word for son, and calling him Simon the son of John would distinguish him from other Simons, since most of them wouldn't also have fathers named John. But what if you didn't know the name of the person's father? Well, in that case, you might refer to them with reference to a different relative, say a brother. Thus, Peter's brother can be referred to as Andrew, the brother of Simon. Uniquely, in Jesus' case, he's referred to as the son of Mary. In the case of women, you might refer to them by the names of their husbands. Thus, Luke refers to Joanna, the wife of Chusa, and John refers to Mary, the wife of Clopas. But what do you do if you aren't acquainted with the person's relatives, if you don't know their names? Well, in that case, they were probably from somewhere else, since you know everybody in your own village, and so you could use their place of origin as a substitute. This is why Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth, because outside of Nazareth, people didn't know his family, and so they used the town in which he grew up. Inside of Nazareth, they wouldn't have called him this and would have used his family to identify him instead. This gives us the information we need to figure out the puzzle of the Marys. Both Luke and John refer to one of the Marys as the sister of Martha, and John adds that she was the sister of Lazarus also. They thus follow the standard naming conventions of the time. Modern biblical scholars often refer to the group as the Bethany family, since that's where they lived. Bethany is a small village just outside Jerusalem on the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives. And this was their stable place of residence. In fact, John introduces Lazarus by referring to him as Lazarus of Bethany. And he then follows up by saying Bethany was the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So they were all identified with Bethany in Judea. If you were from somewhere else and knew only one of the siblings, you would have used of Bethany as their identifier. In fact, modern scholars often refer to Mary as Mary of Bethany, to avoid the lengthier phrase, Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. This means that when Luke and John refer to another of the Marys as Mary Magdalene, they are referring to a different person. They already have a way of referring to the Mary who was related to Martha and Lazarus. They've already introduced her to their audience using the sibling identifier. And so it would be misleading for their audience if they suddenly switched the identifier to something else and didn't mention to the readers that they're still talking about the same person. This is confirmed when we look at the identifier they use for Mary Magdalene. Magdalene is a place name. Mary Magdalene means Mary of Magdala. Magdala was a major fishing port on the Sea of Galilee, which is, of course, located up north in Galilee, way far away from Bethany down in Jerusalem. That tells us several things. First, it tells us that Mary Magdalene was a Galilean, being from a city in Galilee. Second, it tells us that she had no relatives who were well known in the Christian community. In particular, she had no husband, which fits with the fact that she was free to follow the itinerant prophet Jesus. And third, it tells us she was a different person than Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who was from a village in Judea. And so the puzzle is solved. Despite earlier identifications of Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany, they really are two different people. This has become clear as the Dicastery for Divine Worship notes in recent studies that have carefully examined the way first-century Jewish names worked. The growing awareness of the fact that the two women were distinct resulted first in giving the Bethany family a common day on the Roman Martyrology, and later in giving them a common day on the general calendar. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit the bell to get notified whenever I have a new video. And you can also help us keep making this podcast and get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. God bless you always.